Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon and The Blackest Heart, both published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Today I'm going to be reviewing My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, a book also published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. And so let's get into it. Maybe you saw my review of The Only Good Indians earlier this year, a horror book that I loved. And after reading this horror novel, I gotta say, I think we found another Stephen King. You know, we've got Stephen King, Robert McCammon, Dean Koontz. We've got a lot of great horror novelists. Clive Barker. I mean, this Stephen Graham Jones, he's gonna be right there with the rest of them, just blowing it up big time with great horror stories. So let's talk about this book that Saga Press put together. You know, we always review the covers. Saga always does really good covers. I think this one is simple yet elegant and gets the point of the book across very well. So we're going to give that an A. And then the Audible version, I listened to the audible.com version. This was read by a voice narrator named Kara G. Did a great job. Perfect voice for a book that's about a young female teenage girl. And, you know, to have the voice narrator kind of pull that off was great. So let's talk about the book itself. The book is about Jade. Now, Jade is a young girl living in a small Idaho town. She's Native American. The town is set on a lake. Now, the lake has a dark past and a dark history. It was kind of like there was a town in a valley. A dam broke and washed over the town, and now the town is at the bottom of a lake. So there's a history there. There's also a campground across from the town that Jade lives in that has got a dark past, sort of a slasher film past. And we're going to talk about slasher films a lot in this book, because this is like this whole entire book is almost a tribute to every slasher film you've ever watched, especially from the 70s, 80s, 90s, things like that. I mean, this is like Stephen Graham Jones's love letter to slasher films and horror movies. Everything from Jaws to Scream to Nightmare on Elm Street to, you know, Halloween, Friday the 13th. I mean, just Chainsaw Massacre, all of them combined. Even some of the modern ones like Final Destination and Saw and those things. I mean, this is just, you can tell. One of the reasons I loved The Only Good Indians was because you could tell just by the way Stephen Graham Jones was writing the book that he was having fun writing the book. Again, we get prose and a story and just an absolute love for what he's talking about. And you can tell that every word that he's putting in this book, he just loves putting that word there. And you can't help but not be impressed or not like a book when you can tell the writer is having fun while he writes it. So, let's get back to the plot with Jade. We've got that out of the way. This is a really good this is a well-written love letter to Thrasher films. Every Thrasher, we'll go on about this for a second more, because I wanted to talk about this. Every Thrasher film is mentioned. In fact, I got to the point where so many were being referenced and mentioned, and I had not seen a lot of these. So what I was doing when one of them had come up that I hadn't seen, like a scene in a Thrasher film that he references and I hadn't seen it, I would go to YouTube and Google the scene and watch it, just so I could see what he was talking about, and it really, really helped me understand the book a lot more. Not only that, but it added like an extra layer of coolness to the book, just for me personally, because now I was like looking for those hidden gems in the book that I didn't know about or wasn't familiar about, so I could Google them and see if there was a clip somewhere on YouTube about what he was talking about, and I found everything that I was looking for. And it opened my eyes up to a lot of different horror films that I wasn't necessarily aware of. That being said, let's get back to Jade. She is a young Native American girl living in this town, but I've described sort of what it is. And also in the town over the hill, they're building the rich people are building like a rich person's community. So we've got this poor small town, a rich person's community, a haunted underwater town that's been submerged, and a campground that also has a history. And this is all the stuff that boils together in Jade's universe. On top of that, she is living with her father in this town. It's a lonely town. All she's obsessed with is these Thrasher films. These are, I mean, her father is very, very dark and abusive. He's just not a good guy. And one of the things that Stephen Graham Jones does about in this book is talk about the father-daughter relationship, and specifically sort of thematically talks about how in the Native American community there can be a lot of child abuse, and he goes into this subject unflinchingly, which is kind of interesting to get that perspective of, you know, the suicide rates amongst young Native Americans and things that go along in their families, because Stephen Graham Jones grew up in these types of places, and so he knows a lot about that. I'm still trying to get to the story of Jade. We talked about theme, setting, and now slasher films. Now let's talk about Jade. There's a reason I'm wearing the Motley Crue shirt and my Motley Crue Funko Pops are over here. It's because Jade loves Motley Crue. Any main character that loves Motley Crue and hair metal bands, I'm into. I mean, she's into slasher films, hair metal bands from the 80s. I mean, she's a modern girl, but man, she really likes stuff from the past, which is just great. And she thinks of herself and these other kids. She meets a girl from the rich community who she's very taken with because the girl just looks like a princess. And Jade starts to talk about the final girl. Like in every horror movie, there's the final girl that kills the baddie, right? It's kind of like the trope. Sort of like Jamie Lee Curtis kills the baddie at the end of every Halloween movie or whatever she's in. Friday the 13th. I can't remember which ones. But Jade would remember in this book, because she knows everything about these movies. She's obsessed with the final girl. She kind of wants to be the final girl, but then she meets this rich girl who she can definitely tell would be final girl material. And everything, and she's kind of got, I don't know whether it's just her quirky personality or a side effect of the abuse that she serves, but she's just an awkward, Jade is just an awkward teenager, and she often in just casual conversations quotes lines out of these slasher films, which people just are like, man, is this girl mentally ill or what's up? But she's just a quirky, delightfully quirky character. Thank goodness for the readers, because you really start to pull for her. And her quest to be a final girl, or to have her friend with the last name Mondragon be a final girl. So she's got these people that have moved into this new neighborhood, this new rich community, and she really befriends one of these rich girls who looks like a princess to her, and she's like, that girl's so fine and beautiful, she's a final girl. You know, and Jade just assumes, since there's stuff going on under the lake, since there was a bad history in the campground, there's just a bad vibe around the town, that a slasher, a serial killer, is going to come through at any moment and start killing everybody. That's kind of what's going on in her head. Not only that, but she's dealing with the kind of abusive household situation she lives in. And that's kind of all I'm going to get into. You know, one of the things that there was a movie Just Before Dawn that Stephen Graham Jones brings up. Well, Jade brings it up, and she talks about the final scene in that. And that's one of the ones that was one of the ones I first YouTubed. And it got me interested in YouTubing the other scenes that I wasn't familiar with. And then also, there was, I learned some of the scenes that stuck out to me. I learned how to float a dead elk across a lake in Idaho. If perchance you need to get a dead elk across a large body of water, you can learn that in this book, and it's fascinating. Fascinating. You got to plug certain holes and fill things with air. I won't go any more with that, but anyway, it's just some quirky, there's just, with Stephen Graham Jones, I found like with Stephen King, Stephen Graham Jones just adds those little bits and touches of weird things that just crop up in the story that make you go, man, this is a dynamite writer. This is just a really dynamite writer. And that's all the plot I'm going to give you. I want to talk a little bit about the afterword, where Stephen Graham Jones has about a 5-page afterword where he talks about the genesis of this book and why he wrote it. And as I was reading the afterword, I was almost more interested in that than the book itself, because in that afterword, I found out that me and Stephen Graham Jones have a lot of similar backgrounds. I mean, he grew up in small towns. He grew up Stephen King fan. He grew up a fan of hair metal bands. The same thing. I grew up in a small desert southern Utah town, and half the kids in my high school were Native American, and it sounds like that Stephen Graham Jones grew up in communities where half the kids were white, half Native American. I get the whole thing. I get it. And I just think that all of the things that he was mentioning in his afterwards, I was like, I think I don't know the guy. I've never met the guy, even though we're published by the same publisher. I've never met the guy. The publisher didn't pay me to do this. I do these book reviews of my own volition, and I just would be like, man, if I met Stephen Graham Jones, I think we would have a lot to talk about. I think we would have a good conversation. Anyway, I enjoyed My Heart is a Chainsaw. I hope I got you pumped up enough about it to read it. I hope what I said interested you enough about to read it. Where the horror novel is just like Stephen King novels, the horror isn't necessarily the guy with a chainsaw slashing people to bits. The horror is in just the everyday lives of young kids who are living in abusive situations. I mean, that's kind of one of the themes, and how they cope with it. And one of the things that Jade does to cope with it is just become obsessed with her music and her horror films and all of that. And it's just a great story. And bloody and gory, I didn't even mention that. And it's got some bloody, gory scenes in it, just like this one did. Surprising, and in some surprising spots. So, I give My Heart is a Chainsaw a solid 9.5 out of 10. I think it's a great horror read, and I think Stephen Graham Jones, after the 2 books that I've read of his right here, is going to be the next big thing in horror that everybody needs to start collecting.